Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Elmhurst College is marking the centennial of the graduation of two of our most esteemed alumni, Reinhold Niebuhr, class of 1910, and H. Richard Niebuhr, his younger brother, class of 1912. We do so with the third annual Niebuhr Forum on Religion and Public Life. We celebrate the enduring relevance of their thought and their work in the 21st century. The Niebuhrs, as you may know, are considered two of the most influential theologians of the 20th century. Reinhold Niebuhr focused on the persistence of evil in human affairs, and he warned against a tendency toward sinful pride in individuals and self-righteous crusades by nations. His younger brother, H. Richard, called our attention to the social roots of all theological constructs, thereby grounding and relativizing the truth claims of religions in their historical times and places. To mark the Niebuhr centennial, we're pleased to have with us Mr. Ross Douthat to present Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics. Introducing Mr. Douthat is Professor Paul Parker, Chair of our Religious Studies Department. Welcome, everyone. Paul.
One of the most helpful insights of modernity is the pestering truth that all of our analyses, our evaluations and syntheses are at least in part autobiographical. They may go beyond self-declaration, but even our most critical thinking contains autobiography. Elmhurst College's core values of intellectual excellence, community, social responsibility, stewardship, faith, meaning, and value are not new, but beat in the breasts of the Reverend Inspector Carl Kranz and those 14 students in 1871 when they first started their classes in what has become since then Elmhurst College. Truth be told, those first students inherited their core values, our core values, from their parents and from their parents' culture. Just as their parents had inherited those same values from their parents and their parents before them, and on back through the generations. Our core values are deeply autobiographical, interpreted and reinterpreted throughout the ages, adapted to new situations, and fundamentally human. The deepest questions of life for Zarathustra and Moses, for the Buddha and the prophets, for Jesus and for Muhammad, for Baha'u'llah and for Martin Luther King Jr., those challenges still we face today. This is also true of our guest speaker this evening. Mr. Ross Douthat was born in California, raised in Connecticut by parents who are an attorney and professional writers. He attended and excelled in his studies at Hamden Hall, an elite private high school, and at Harvard University. So he knew his material well when, in 2005, he co-authored his first book entitled Privilege, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class. While at Harvard, Mr. Douthat edited the prestigious and politically conservative bi-weekly journal known as the Harvard Salient. He has gone on to contribute to renowned conservative publications such as the National Review, the Wall Street Journal, the Weekly Standard. So he knew his material very well when he wrote in 2008 his second book entitled Grand New Party, How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. David Brooks called this book the best roadmap for the Republican Party. Now, since 2009, Mr. Douthat has been the youngest op-ed columnist for the New York Times, where he has written insightfully on a wide number of issues, which, not surprisingly, include the presidential campaign. His topic tonight is the same title of a recent book, earlier published this year, Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics. This book, too, finds autobiographical antecedents. He was baptized Episcopalian and attended Episcopalian churches as a young child. In his middle years of childhood, he and his family attended charismatic worship service, charismatic healing services, and evangelical churches. When he was 17 years old, he made a conscious decision, following his parents, but separate from them, to commit himself to the Roman Catholic Church. He is a convinced Catholic, convinced of its historical and theological continuity. These diverse and complex Christian experiences give him a unique perspective from which to write critically about religion in America. The apple does not fall far from the tree. Please help me in welcoming Mr. Ross Douthat to the podium.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me, first of all? It's always an important question to ask. Thank you so much, Professor, for that incredibly kind introduction that will be extremely difficult to actually live up to, but I will do my best. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you all for coming. I'm aware that there is some other sort of semi-political performance taking place in about 50 minutes. The time zone shift from East Coast to Central Time left me slightly confused, and I thought I had 2 hours before you all fled for the local bar to play Joe Biden drinking games and so on. But I'm going to attempt to finish my remarks before the vice presidential debate begins, and then we can go into Q&A. But if any of you feel the need to flee in order to participate more fully in the pageant of American democracy, I obviously understand that as well. So my theme tonight, broadly speaking, is the theme of the book that I published earlier this year, which is trying to be sort of an overview of contemporary American Christianity, both how we got here, where we've come from, and the state of things today. But in the spirit of this forum and this college and the statue of Reinhold Niebuhr that I passed on my way in, I'm going to try and narrow my topic a bit tonight and sort of pick out one of the strands in the broader story I tell in the book and focus in particularly on the recent history and the current state of liberal Christianity in the United States, and particularly liberal Christianity as embodied by the mainline Protestant churches, the Christianity of Methodism and my childhood faith, Episcopalianism, Presbyterianism, the United Church of Christ, and so on, which for generations enjoyed a unique position and a kind of unparalleled influence in our national life. And so thinking about mainline Protestantism, I want to start by taking you back more than 50 years to the pretty grand unveiling late in the 1950s of the National Council of Churches, a kind of mainline Protestant umbrella group's new Manhattan headquarters, a 19-story mini skyscraper that was intended as a kind of Protestant Vatican, if you will, that all the mainline churches could call home. The money for this center, it was called the Interchurch Center, came from the Northern Baptist John D. Rockefeller Jr., who guaranteed the National Council of Churches a 99-year rent-free lease. This was long before, you know, the mortgage bubble and anyway. But, and the cornerstone for the building had been excavated from the marketplace of ancient Corinth in Greece. The place, the next day's New York Times reported in an extensive account of the ceremony, where the New Testament reports that the Apostle Paul stayed 1 year and 6 months teaching the Word of God. And that cornerstone was laid in the autumn of 1958 by Dwight D. Eisenhower himself, whose grand progress from Riverside Church to the construction site was joined by 200 choristers, 300 religious leaders, and 37 banners representing various denominational participants. The spirit of the ceremony was the spirit of the age, of the post-war revival in American Christianity, of the era of consensus in American politics and culture, a celebration of Christian convergence and institutional vitality in which 30,000 people heard the President of the United States hail the nation's churches as, quote, sturdy defenders of the constitutional and God-given rights of each citizen, and religion itself as the firm foundation for the nation's moral life. And readers of the next day's Times, you'll note that I only quote from that fine newspaper, were informed by no less an authority than the President of the United Nations General Assembly that the new center's main purpose was to draw together the scattered sheep of Jesus Christ. And when it came time for New York City to rename the street in front of this new center, a little time later, there was only one possibility. To this day, the section of West 120th Street between Broadway and Riverside Drive is known as Reinhold Niebuhr Place, which is as it should be, because Niebuhr himself embodied what was best about the liberal mainline Protestantism of his era. And I'm using the term liberal here in the sense of a Christianity that is deeply engaged with modernity rather than walled off from or hostile to modernity's currents, but liberal too in the sense that being convinced that Christianity should offer a call to social reform as well as to personal conversion. And Niebuhr himself was the ideal type of a species that is all but lost to us today. The public theologian, if you will, engaged with a particular Christian tradition, but capable of setting an agenda for the secular world as well. And there were obviously many such figures in the post-war era, from native-born Americans like Niebuhr's brother Richard, and the Jesuit political philosopher John Courtney Murray, to European emigres like the Catholic Jacques Maritain, the German Protestant Paul Tillich, and so on. But Niebuhr loomed over them all. He was the leading thinker of the mainline Protestant establishment in what were, in hindsight, its last years of cultural supremacy. He was the most sophisticated interpreter of the American soul at a moment when the United States had suddenly achieved global preeminence and was reckoning with the moral challenges of the nuclear age. And for a generation of intellectuals and academics, his preaching and writing offered a model of a kind of highbrow Christianity and offered a reason to look anew at the rigors of a serious religious faith. And even in the popular religious culture, his Serenity Prayer was adopted by Alcoholics Anonymous, which was itself actually one of the most enduring legacies of that post-war religious revival, and it soon claimed a place alongside the Hail Mary and the Our Father in the vernacular of American piety. And to this day, Niebuhr remains a kind of universal intellectual, claimed as an inspiration by Protestants and Catholics, by liberals and conservatives, by believers and even atheists alike. And Niebuhr was, in certain ways, an unlikely figure to become a pillar of a kind of East Coast religious establishment. He was born to a German Lutheran pastor in Wright City, Missouri in 1892. He was obviously educated right here in the Midwest. The first 13 years of his public career were spent as the pastor of Bethel Evangelical Church on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit, where he gained a reputation for what one of his biographers called volcanic activity. He was constantly preaching and writing and traveling, throwing himself into the controversies of his city, his denomination, and his country. And it was this activity that ultimately brought him to the attention of Henry Sloane Coffin, who was the dean of Union Theological Seminary in New York, sort of the Protestant mainline's flagship school, who decided to offer the 30-something Niebuhr a teaching position despite his conspicuous lack of a PhD. And as someone who lacks a PhD myself, I'm always gratified by these stories of academic positions becoming available to those of us who haven't actually run the academic gauntlet. But so when Niebuhr arrived at Union, the seminary and the mainline denominations that it served were dominated by what we think of as theological modernism, the kind of theological school and worldview that had been developed beginning in the late Victorian era as a response to the challenges posed to Christianity by Darwinism on the one hand and the historical criticism of the Bible on the other. And the modernist goal overall was to adapt Christianity to the new scientific and historical consensus and to maintain the relevance of faith in an intellectual climate that had suddenly grown dismissive of the authority of Scripture. And to this end, they tended to stress ethics rather than eschatology, social reform rather than confessional debates. And their great project, of course, was the social gospel, which urged believers to embrace a kind of applied Christianity, to put Jesus' commandments into practice in the political, in the here and now. And there were parts of Christianity that represented parts of modernism, that represented liberal Christianity, broadly speaking, at its most effective, in making a sustained attempt to engage with a changing world without losing sight of the biblical heart of Christian faith. But there was also temptations involved in this project. It was easy for the modernists to go one step further and simply jettison controversial and difficult Christian doctrines that seemed to conflict with the new science and scholarship and archaeology. And to this end, many modernists ended up stripping away anything transcendent and mysterious from Christianity, scoffing at the miraculous, dismissing creeds as irrelevant, downgrading original sin, putting their faith in what Walter Rauschenbusch, the father of the social gospel, rather over-optimistically called the immense latent perfectibility in human nature. And instead of merely reconciling faith with Darwinian science, they sometimes subordinated their faith to a more vulgar social Darwinism. They divinized capital P progress and treated the unfolding of secular history itself as the only dispositive revelation of God's purposes on earth. And this led to a danger in which politics could become their religion, and an earthly utopia their only religious goal. Now, in Europe, the modernist project effectively came to grief in the trenches of World War I, its utopianism gassed and machine-gunned and garroted on barbed wire. In America, though, the moment for real reconsideration didn't arise until the 1930s, with storm clouds gathering once again in Europe and the nation entering the dark valley of the Great Depression. But when that reconsideration came, Niebuhr himself ended up being the crucial figure. He had grown up with modernist theology, but the more he immersed himself in the political and social controversies of his era, the more over-optimistic the modernist project came to seem. About midway through my ministry, he wrote in 1939, which extends roughly from the Peace of Versailles to the Peace of Munich, I underwent a conversion of thought which involved a rejection of most of the theological ideals I had ventured forth with in 1915. And in place of these sort of modernist mistakes, Niebuhr ended up championing what is often described as a kind of neo-orthodoxy, although Niebuhr himself preferred the term prophetic Christianity, which sort of tried to put aside modernism's blithe cosmic optimism and insisted on the relevance of traditional Christian concepts, as we heard at the beginning, like original sin and divine judgment. Neo-orthodoxy's emphases differed from thinker to thinker. They differed between Reinhold and Richard, brother to brother, and so on, but the overall pattern held. This was a liberal Christianity that rejected utopianism in all its forms, that tried to return to Protestantism's Reformation roots, that took a renewed interest in creedal and confessional and liturgical issues, that stressed the saving life and death as opposed to just the ethical message of Jesus Christ, and that demanded greater Christian humility in the face of the mysteries of human life and God's purposes. And Niebuhr's particular emphasis, again, as was said at the beginning, was on humanity's irredeemable sinfulness. Not irredeemable in an ultimate Christian sense, obviously, but irredeemable sort of in the moment-to-moment here and now. What one of his contemporaries called the stubbornness of evil in the human situation, which no philosophy could overcome and no political regime could legislate away. But it's crucial to note that this pessimism didn't lead Niebuhr to abandon politics or to break with political liberalism. He famously rejected the pacifism of the 1930s. He embraced Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, and nor did it lead him nor did it lead him into a kind of back towards a kind of pre-liberal view of Christian theology. He remained a deep critic of Protestant fundamentalism. He was a sort of waspish critic of Billy Graham in the 1950s. He was very skeptical about my own Roman Catholic Church. Instead, Niebuhr preached a chastened form of liberal Christianity, which was, again, alive to the possibility of social reform, but constantly attuned to the realities of power and the perpetual temptations of hubris, self-righteousness, and pride. And the influence of Niebuhr's vision was not some narrowly confined to his theological circle. If you look at the post-war revival in American Christianity in the 40s and 50s, it was first and foremost a popular revival, with church attendance rising, church construction rising, biblical epics being churned out in Hollywood, and so on. But it was an intellectual revival as well, manifested in some of the public theologians I've mentioned above, but also in the works of novelists and poets and memoirists, and W.H. Auden, Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, Flannery O'Connor. For many intellectuals, as well as for many ordinary Americans, after the death camps and the gulags, it was harder to credit the naive progressive belief that the modern age just represented this long upward march towards ever greater enlightenment and peace. Instead, in that sort of chastened era, there was a sudden demand for writers who could revise the story that modernity told about itself, explaining what had gone wrong and why, with reference to ideas and traditions that the previous generation's intelligentsia, religious and secular, had sometimes dismissed as out of date. As a writer for the Times Literary Supplement put it in 1954, surveying the American scene, both the social climate for religious living and the intellectual climate for religious thinking had become much more congenial in America in the years following World War II. Or as Niebuhr himself wrote when asked to assess the revival of religion in the pages of the Sunday New York Times, he wrote, "Mass conversions under the ministrations of popular evangelists were proceeding at a pace unseen since the days of Billy Sunday. But at the same time, there was an unexpected receptivity towards the message of the historic faiths among intellectuals, which is, he wrote, is in marked contrast to the indifference or hostility of past decades." Now again, every branch of American Christianity, Catholic, evangelical, the African American church, benefited from this trend, but the Protestant mainline in particular enjoyed a kind of twilight glow, what is in hindsight a kind of twilight glow, during the years of the Niebuhrs and Neo-Orthodoxy. Those were the last years when Presbyterians and United Methodists and Episcopalians would see a sustained growth in church membership and attendance. It was the last era for many of the mainline churches when they conducted serious missionary efforts overseas. The last period when their leadership seemed to care as much about evangelization as political activism. And it was the last era really when the Protestant mainline had a substantial culture of its own, when magazines with names like Presbyterian Life and the American Lutheran, I always want to read the American Lutheran, reached millions of subscribers, when mainline intellectuals talked without embarrassment about winning America for Protestantism, and when their churches had enough money and manpower to throw up new building projects, new centers, new churches, almost as quickly as the other branches of American Christianity. With birth rates high and with churches expanding, the present was bright and the future seemed assured. In 1955, the dean of Yale Divinity School told Newsweek that in the next 20 years, American Protestantism, by which he pretty clearly meant mainline Protestantism, will enlarge its numbers by 1/3. Now, this did not happen. And it certainly didn't happen in the churches that a Yale Divinity School dean in 1955 would have had in mind when he talked about Protestantism. Instead, the Protestant mainline's membership stopped growing relatively abruptly in the mid-1960s and then just as swiftly plunged. Of the 11 Protestant churches that had claimed more than 1 million members in the early 70s, 8 of them had fewer members in 1973 than in 1965. There were 10.6 million United Methodists in 1960, 11 million at mid-decade, and 10.6 million again by 1970, and then it was down thereafter. The Lutherans peaked in 1968, the Episcopalians in 1966, the United Church of Christ in 1965. Soon they were all in steep decline. The Presbyterian Church USA lost about 1.5 million members between the mid-1960s and the late 1980s. By the early 1990s, 60% of Methodist parishioners were over 50, and there were more Muslims in America than Episcopalians. Now, membership numbers don't tell the whole story. A religious tradition is more than just the raw number of people in the pews. It's a network, a culture, a complex web of communities and institutions. But here, too, starting in the 1960s, the culture of mainline Protestantism basically disintegrated. Church school enrollment plunged. Seminary enrollment, divinity school enrollment declined. Donations dried up. Budgets were cut. Churches ran enormous deficits. Foreign missionary work almost disappeared. The great church building campaign of the 50s ended, and churches began to close. The flood of those denominational magazines and newspapers became a stream and then a trickle as publications merged and shrank and closed up shop. Now, how did this happen? Not, I want to emphasize, and this is the theme of my book as a whole, but particularly applies in this case, because Americans as a whole suddenly became atheists, became completely secularized in any way, shape, or form. Indeed, the crisis of mainline Protestantism occurred at a time when overall public interest in religious ideas and experiences was remaining constant in certain ways, increasing in others. Belief in God, in an afterlife, and in intercessory prayer remained basically constant or even rose from the 60s through the 80s. Americans were slightly more likely to believe in life after death in the 1990s than in the 1940s. The percentage of Americans Americans who reported a personal encounter with the divine rose dramatically between 1955 or so and the turn of the millennium. The influence of bishops and pastors might have been ebbing, but in the 60s and 70s there was a glut of gurus and sages, new prophets, rediscovered holy men, from Charles Reich to Khalil Gibran to George Gurdjieff to Timothy Leary and many more. We're searching for more immediate, ecstatic, and penetrating modes of living, Hillary Clinton said of her generation at Wellesley's 1969 commencement. And this quest was religious as often as it was political or sexual or pharmacological. In this sense, the optimists, the religious optimists of the Kennedy era or the Eisenhower era weren't wrong to look ahead to the 60s and 70s and predict that the new decade would be a fertile epoch for religion, even more fertile maybe than the post-war revival had been. If you look at the 60s and 70s from a certain angle, they resemble classic Great Awakening periods in American life, in which a surge of social activism coexists with all kinds of religious freelancing and startups and so on. But the big difference is that for all the short-term chaos they created, the awakenings of the 18th and 19th century tended to end by strengthening at least some forms of institutional Christianity rather than weakening them. Previous Great Awakenings injected new energy into moribund churches, inspired existing denominations to imitate the tactics of startup sects, and they swelled the ranks of Orthodox traditional believers even as they inspired a dizzying array of more heretical experiments. But in the 1960s and 70s, you might say, the heretics just carried the day. Right? It was a golden age for religious thought if you wanted to talk about crystals or UFOs, the Kama Sutra. It was a fertile period if you said Christianity but meant fundamentalism or Marxism or the New Age. But amid all this enthusiasm, all this hunger for the numinous and transcendence and revolutionary, the message of a more traditional Christianity seemed to have lost its credibility. Now, why did this happen? Well, there are probably 6,220 reasons, but let me give you 4 big ones, right? One big factor, I think, in the weakening of institutional Christianity in this period was just the impact of political polarization. And this is something I think we should all be able to understand because it is very much with us and in a sort of an accelerating form today. But one of the advantages for Christian figures in the 1950s and early 60s, whether it was a Niebuhr or a Martin Luther King or a Billy Graham, was that the political scene, while divided between liberals and conservatives, had not been sort of ideologically sorted in quite the way it is today. You still had conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. The two parties were sort of hodgepodges of geographical and regional interests as well as ideological interests, and this made it easier, in a sense, for a kind of public Christianity to hold itself apart from liberal causes on the one hand, conservative causes on the other, and to sort of speak, set itself apart, speak more prophetically at times. The ability of a figure like Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement to ultimately attract support from Republicans and Democrats alike contrasts very sharply with the reform movements of our own day, which end up being inevitably either sort of purely Democratic concerns or purely Republican concerns. And so as polarization increases, the public witness of Christianity ends up being co-opted, in a sense, by one party or another. It's very hard to be something other than a conservative first and a Christian second, a liberal first and Christian second. And you can see this, I think, in the transformation that enabled, imagine how the 1950s would have been different if Billy Graham had run for president as a Republican, or if Martin Luther King had run for president as a Democrat. Now, flash forward 30 years to figures like a Pat Robertson or a Jesse Jackson, who bear some similarities in certain ways to a King or a Graham. They feel not only perfectly comfortable, but almost obligated to sort of become not just politically engaged, but actual partisan politicians running for president on the Republican and Democratic ticket. And I think that sort of particular shift tells us a lot about the broader shift in our culture and the difficulty that the Christian churches have finding a place to stand that isn't sort of automatically polarized into one camp or another. So you have that polarization. Then you have, obviously, the sexual revolution, right, which creates a set of issues and challenges for Christianity that just don't really exist in the America of 1945, 1935, and so on. And, this is driven by the birth control pill. It's driven by the rise of no-fault divorce. And it's driven, above all, by just a complete revolution in heterosexual life that is sometimes obscured to us today because so many of the debates about culture war issues and so on revolve around the particular issue of gay marriage and so on, but it's useful to step back and remember how much of this is just, it's about heterosexuality. It's about the sort of courtship and mating patterns of young Americans and middle-aged Americans and so on, and how dramatically they changed from the 1940s till the 1970s, and how much that change severed the previous connection between the traditional New Testament emphasis on chastity and continence and so on, and sort of cultural common sense, right? In the world of 1940, even for people who weren't devout Christians, the basic idea, that you wanted to probably, if you were having sex with someone, it probably made sense to be someone you would consider marrying down the line. That made a kind of sort of intuitive sense to people in a way that it ceased to in the world that the birth control pill, no-fault divorce, and so on created. And that shift has just sort of created a perpetual sense that the Christian view of sexual ethics, the New Testament view of sexual ethics, is simply out of date. That, if at worst it's actively repressive, but at best it's just a sort of ideal that has no real purchase on modern realities. And again, no Christian church, I think, has successfully and perfectly found a way to address this challenge and sort of, convince people that the Christian message in general is a completely plausible guide to modern sexual life. So you have sex, you also have money, right? If America sort of diverges in striking ways from the message of the New Testament on sex, it also, builds up a level of extraordinary wealth, beginning with the post-war boom and continuing to the present day, that, creates obvious tensions with the New Testament emphasis on renunciation, its skepticism of acquisitiveness and greed and so on. And this has sort of broad consequences for American life. It also has very specific consequences for instance, the number of people going into seminary, not only Catholic seminary, but Protestant, especially mainline Protestant seminaries as well. There's always an element of sacrifice, obviously, involved in taking up a religious vocation. But in a world where the amount of wealth available to the professional classes, to doctors and lawyers and investment bankers and so on, increases as dramatically as it did from 1950 to the present, the costs of going into the ministry, of giving up on the wealth available to you as a well-educated American graduate of a college or a graduate school and so on, those costs go up dramatically, and as a result, the caliber of people going into divinity schools goes way down. And you can trace, it's not just numerical, it's the number of, Phi Beta Kappa graduates who go into divinity schools. All of this traces a downward trajectory, again, in Catholicism and Protestantism alike, and it has an inevitable impact on the kind of people who are out, taking leadership roles in Christian churches, making the public case for Christianity, and so on. And then the final factor, I think, is the impact of sort of globalization, decolonization, the extent to which first television and then the internet sort of brings the world in all its teeming diversity into American homes as never before. All of that creates a climate, again, not of secularism, but of relativism, right? A sense that as interested as you may be in religion, it's harder and harder to believe that your particular religious tradition can possibly be the one true faith, given how dizzying and diverse and complicated the world is, especially when your own historic tradition, Christianity, seems to be implicated in the sins of European colonial powers, right, that were very much at the forefront of popular consciousness during the era of decolonization in the 60s and 70s. And the irony, of course, is that that same era produces an upsurge in Christian conversions in the developing world, right? As the hand of imperialism and colonialism is lifted in Africa and Asia, Christianity seems more credible than it had before when it was an alien imposition by foreign powers. But in the West itself, Christianity seems to be discredited by its association with imperial regimes, the sins of the European past, and so on. So you have political polarization, you have sex, you have money, you have globalization, the relativism that follows in its wake, and all of these challenges created problems and challenges for American Christianity as a whole, and every church and tradition in certain ways tried to, resist them, but also accommodate themselves to them. It's not hard to look around the landscape of conservative Christianity in the United States, for instance, and find ways in which conservative Christians compromised on issues related to capitalism and wealth. You only have to turn on a Joel Osteen broadcast to see those kind of compromises being made every day. But mainline Protestantism, I think, was distinctive in the sense that its leadership tried and tried and tried to renovate their churches and doctrines the most in certain ways in order to keep themselves relevant in the new dispensation. So the mainline churches were more likely, or at least they were likely first, before the religious right really got off the ground, to embrace political causes beyond the civil rights movement of the 50s, looking for the next great cause after civil rights, whether it was the anti-Vietnam War movement, whether it was environmentalism, the Equal Rights Amendment, the campaign for nuclear disarmament, the movement for gay rights, and so on. These churches were most likely to go the furthest in embracing the sexual revolution. Most mainline Protestant denominations made a sort of gradual but pretty consistent move from first accepting divorce but forbidding remarriage to permitting remarriage in any case where the would-be remarrier displayed, this is a passage from a 1982 Lutheran document, a willingness to acknowledge one's own failures in a spirit of forgiveness towards all involved. And over the same period, the traditional prohibition on premarital sex tended to lapse into irrelevance in some denominations. In others, it was explicitly abandoned, replaced by a more palatable-seeming opposition to promiscuity, somewhat hazily defined. By the early 1970s, too, almost every mainline denomination had endorsed some form of legal abortion, which was a very striking concession to contemporary trends, given how far back the traditional Christian opposition to abortion ran. Indeed, again, by the time the controversies over gay ordination and gay marriage began in earnest in the 1980s, the controversies that are sort of at the forefront of these debates now, mainline churches had moved so far from traditional Christian sexual ethics that the approval of homosexuality felt more inevitable in certain ways than wrenching. And at the same time, in response to the culture's turn towards relativism, the mainline churches were the most likely to embrace a kind of relativism of their own, a kind of breezy ecumenism. By the 1990s, the Episcopal Church, the American Methodist Church, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America were all recognizing each other's rights and holy orders. The traditional mainline churches didn't necessarily deny traditional Christian doctrine, but they did tolerate such denials. John Shelby Spong, the Episcopal Bishop of Newark in the 1980s, moved from denying the virgin birth to denying the very existence of a personal God without facing any real sanction. And at the same time, they tended to gradually purge the specifics of Christian theology from their public language. Traditional belief wasn't officially abandoned, it was downgraded, declared optional, and often just ignored. Creeds divide, deeds unite. That was the refrain. And so the distinctive theological traditions that had once distinguished Presbyterians from Methodists and Lutherans from Congregationalists were steadily effaced. Now, the idea behind all these moves was inclusion. Inclusion of women through the ordination of female ministers and priests, and the recasting of creeds and liturgies along more gender-neutral lines, inclusion of racial minorities and immigrants, inclusion of the young cohabitating couple, the older divorcee, the gay man, the lesbian, inclusion of the counterculture through folk music services and rock and roll liturgies, inclusion of the seeker, the doubter, the lukewarm believer, the agnostic, inclusion even of the explicitly non-Christian. The Manhattan headquarters of the National Council of Churches, the building whose opening I began with, originally conceived as a meeting place for the scattered sheep of Christianity, eventually became an interfaith center instead, a richly diverse community of many faiths. The head of the NCC said at its centennial: Protestant, Orthodox, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, and more. Christianity's problem, the leaders of the mainline had decided, was that it turned too many people off. It was too rigid in its moral teachings, too exclusive in its truth claims, too remote from the problems of the world, of this moment on earth. And only a more inclusive faith, they assumed, could succeed where traditional Christianity seemed to be failing, and sustain the faith amid the various forces undercutting the older dogmas and traditions. This was not an implausible theory. This was, in fact, a completely understandable response to those massive challenges facing every Christian church in the 60s and 70s. But it didn't work out as its architects hoped. The numbers that I sketched above, the rapid decline in mainline churches in the 1970s and 80s, continued apace. They slowed a bit in the 1990s, but then they accelerated in the last decade. Christianity must change or die. That was the title of one of Bishop Spong's books, the semi-theistic Episcopal Bishop of Newark, who I mentioned earlier. But what happened to the mainline was that instead of attracting a younger, more open-minded demographic, it changed and died effectively. Last summer, while the Episcopal Church's House of Bishops was in the headlines because it finally approved a right to blame same-sex unions, Episcopalian church attendance figures for the last decade circulated in the religion blogosphere. They showed something between a decline and a total collapse. In the last decade, average Sunday attendance, already down substantially over decades and decades, dropped 23% in the Episcopal Church. Not a single Episcopal diocese in the country saw church-going increase. And you can find similar figures for almost every other mainline denomination. And in many ways, I think both religious liberals and secular liberals have been loath to acknowledge the scope and depth of this crisis. Many of the leaders of the liberal Protestant churches have alternated between a kind of Monty Python-esque, it's just a flesh wound kind of bravado, and a strange self-righteousness about their looming extinction. In a 2005 interview, the Episcopal Church's presiding bishop explained that her communion's members valued the stewardship of the earth too highly to reproduce themselves. And liberal commentators, especially secular commentators, when sort of observers of religion from the outside, consistently tend to hail mainline churches as a model for the Christian future. Again, for understandable reasons, given the challenges Christianity faces, but without reckoning with their decline. In debates about within my own Catholic Church, for instance, there are many writers who simply take it for granted that Catholicism, which is in many ways a mess, would be in much, much better shape if it looked more like Episcopalianism does today. But Episcopalianism is in even worse shape than Catholicism, right? I mean, there were so many outraged critiques of the Vatican's investigation into progressive religious orders in the United States in the last year or so. But almost none of the critiques mentioned the fact that one of the reasons that Rome was intervening was because the religious orders in question were likely to disappear within a generation, that the most progressive elements in the Catholic Church had failed, as the mainline churches had, to find a way to sustain themselves. And I think fewer, especially, again, secular liberal writers observing these debates, noted the consequences of this eclipse. Because progressive Catholicism has failed to inspire a new generation of religious brothers and sisters, Catholic hospitals across the country, for instance, are passing into the hands of more bottom-line focused administrators, the kind of trends that liberals in general tend to be hostile to for understandable reasons. This has inevitable consequences for how religious institutions serve the poor. Now, the somewhat more persuasive take on liberal Christian decline has just sort of folded these particular problems into a broader story of crisis for Christianity in general. The challenges of the 60s and 70s, and then what the liberal Protestant writer Diana Butler Bass calls the religious recession of the last 10 years in particular. And there's real truth to this, right? Again, the trends unleashed in the 60s and 70s, the sexual revolution, consumerism and materialism, and so on, threw all of American Christianity into crisis, ushered in decades of debate about how to keep the nation's churches relevant and vital. And it is not the case that you can say, well, obviously all traditional believers have thrived in this environment. It's simply not true, right? And in the evangelical world, where there's been probably the most growth and so on, the most successful Christian bodies have often been politically conservative, but theologically shallow, preaching a gospel of health and wealth rather than the full New Testament message. And in my own Catholic Church, again, the vocational life of the church went into crisis in the 70s and has sort of stabilized, but hasn't really recovered. And really only Latino immigration to the United States has kept Catholic mass attendance relatively high. And in the last 15 years especially, between the Catholic sex abuse crisis, the apparent ceiling on evangelical Christianity's growth, the rise of a kind of militant new atheism, a backlash against the religious right among younger Americans, all of these trends have dramatically increased the share of Americans identifying with no religious faith at all. So in this environment, there's no justification for conservative Christians to look at the Protestant mainline, to look at liberal churches' decline and act smug or triumphalist, right? When we ask whether liberal Christianity can be saved, we also do have to ask, can Christianity as a whole be saved? And that's a question that all American believers should be wrestling with today. But with that long caveat, that long concession made, the distinctiveness of the liberal church's decline remains an incontrovertible fact. Yes, 2 generations after the Episcopalians and United Methodists went into a long swoon, the Southern Baptists, a more conservative denomination, are experiencing some reversals and so on. You know, you can find real problems outside mainline Protestantism, but it would take literally decades of decline for more conservative churches to come close to sharing mainline Protestantism's current sickness unto death. Most of the vitality and growth in American Protestantism in particular is still concentrated in congregations that are culturally conservative, and the fastest growing form of American Christianity, and there's obviously a lively debate about whether it actually falls under that umbrella, is Mormonism, is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which obviously isn't an orthodox form of Christian faith, but is not remotely self-consciously liberal or progressive either. In 1940, there were roughly 3 Episcopalians for every Mormon. Now it's roughly the reverse. So what is it about the liberal Protestant trajectory that made that decline particularly steep? First of all, I think the leaders of the mainline overestimated the potential for sustaining religious practices by marrying them to secular causes. The more that the mainline churches defined themselves by taking sides in the political give and take, the more they came to be seen as just another faction, an interest group, and so on, with no real transcendence to offer. And transcendence, even in what we talk about as a secular age, is still what people wanted from religion, encounters with the mysterious and the numinous. A faith that promised to make the universe responsive to their prayers and rituals and spiritual gestures and so on. And even when you had sort of forays into mysticism, often through religious syncretism and so on in the Protestant mainline, real mysticism ultimately depends on real belief. And often it seemed that a lot of those efforts in the mainline churches were a kind of play, as the liberal Protestant theologian Harvey Cox described them, with little connection to real conviction. And it's this conviction deficit, I think, above all, that explains the particular failure of the mainline churches to keep believers in their pews. Their pastors and theologians recognized correctly that the foundations of traditional Christianity were being undercut by the social revolutions of their era, but they had failed to identify any new foundation that inspired real piety, real allegiance, and real belief. And any institution that calls human beings to devotion and self-sacrifice needs to justify that call. And over the last 2 generations, the mainline churches, more than other branches of American Christianity, have lacked that institutional justification. Or at least they've lacked a justification to explain why Americans should be involved with their churches in particular. Right? Sort of social activism, while a crucial part of liberal Christianity throughout its history, isn't taken on its own enough. Why would you need to wash down your liberal convictions with a draft of communion wine when you could take the activism straight and sleep in on Sunday morning? Right? Why would you get your mysticism from someone who was sort of deliberately play acting when you could get it from someone who actually believed it? And the ecumenical efforts that often consumed mainline leaders only added to these difficulties by contributing to the impression that mainline Christianity had no distinctive theological convictions, no principles that couldn't be compromised in the name of conciliation and unity. And again, it wasn't just that the leaders of these churches failed to attract parishioners or inspire would-be clergymen to join their seminaries. It was that they themselves often drifted away from the organizations that they were actually heading, looking for something less constraining and restrictive, less dogmatic and demanding. You see this in a figure like Spong, who I mentioned before. You see it in a famous figure like Bishop James Pike, a sort of celebrity Episcopalian bishop in the 60s and 70s, who first set out to renovate Episcopalianism and then decided that, institutional Christianity was just too far gone to fix, and he spent the last years of his life sort of chasing Gnostic scriptures in the Middle East and all the rest of it. Many of the most vocal and active reformers, especially in the 60s and 70s, ended up leaving organized Christianity entirely behind. And sometimes the argument was, well, change hadn't happened as fast as they'd hoped. And sometimes this might have been plausible, but more often they seemed to be in the position of a general who had fought and won a series of battles only to decide that the territory wasn't worth ruling after all. And speaking, and obviously this needs to be taken, with a grain of salt. I'm speaking as an outsider, someone whose Episcopalian past is back in the misty depths of my childhood and so on. But this seems like the core problem facing mainline Protestantism today. When I read mainline Protestants who are optimistic about their church's futures, writers like Diana Butler Bass, who I mentioned earlier, is a very eloquent sort of defender of the current trajectory of the mainline churches, they often seem to be making a kind of virtue of necessity, right? Arguing that the mainline seeming transition to a kind of post-dogmatic, post-belief-based religion is just part of a necessary transition that all American Christianity ultimately needs to make if it's going to adapt to the world of, what we think of as sort of spiritual but not religious seekers, of people who want to mix and match from one religion to another and so on. And there's this perpetual sense, I think, among mainline theologians and leaders and elsewhere that they're just a little bit ahead of their time, right? And that the decline they've experienced is actually, sort of a blessing, right? Bass suggests that because liberal Christians experienced their decline sooner than their conservative kin, they've actually had a longer and more sustained opportunity to explore what a kind of post-institutional faith might mean to 21st century people. This is possible, and it's an optimistic vision, but it seems to me that it ultimately founders on a kind of contradiction, that in the end, religious faith, or at least Christian faith, depends on a kind of community that the mainline churches haven't been able to generate. And the kind of anti-dogmatic, anti-hierarchical spiritual searchers whose journeys writers like Bass see as the template for the Christian and Western religious future, they're doing that searching as individuals rather than as members of the liberal churches and congregations that have kept trying to roll out the welcome mat for them. And I think this individualism has consequences that everybody in America, liberal and conservative, religious and secular, should find worrying rather than cheering. It has consequences for local community because it's harder to care for your neighbor, whatever your motivations, when you don't have a congregation or a community around you to provide resources or support. It has consequences for society as a whole because the decline of institutional churches leaves a void that our government is unlikely to be able to fill, no matter how many elections the Democratic Party wins. And it has consequences for private morality because an individualistic faith is more likely to encourage a kind of solipsism and narcissism in which the voice of the ego gets mistaken for the voice of the divine. And writers who try and make lemonade out of the lemons of mainline Protestant decline end up placing great hopes in a vision of Christianity after organized religion, Christianity after the institutional church. But I feel like we already know what that Christianity looks like. It's the self-satisfied, self-regarding, all-too-American church of, Joel Osteen in Red America and Oprah Winfrey in Blue America, right? It's a faith that, lacking any institutional religious outlet, pours itself into politics instead, investing messianic energy and apocalyptic fears into what should be the ordinary give and take of democratic politics. It's the faith that sociologists have encountered when they often survey today's young adults, my own generation and the one coming after me, which, according to some writers, conceives of God as part divine butler, part cosmic therapist, and which jettisons the more challenging and ultimately important aspects of Christianity that the traditional churches and denominations, for all their many sins and follies, have at least tried to hand down to us intact. Now, is there an alternative? I hope so. And I am not a mainline Protestant. I am not a liberal Christian. I am Catholic, theologically traditional, politically on the right. But not only should religious conservatives not be smug about the struggles of the Protestant mainline, because we're all struggling today, we should wish to live in a world where in some form it revives itself. Whatever its flaws and excesses, the defining idea of liberal Christianity in the United States, that faith, again, should spur social reform as well as personal conversion, has been an immensely positive force in our national life. No one should wish for its extinction, and no Christian in particular should wish for a world where Christianity becomes the exclusive property of the political right. What should be wished for instead is that mainline Protestantism, liberal Christianity, whatever umbrella you want to put over it, recovers a religious reason for its own existence. and that it captures or recaptures, to return to where I began, some of what Reinhold Niebuhr and neo-orthodoxy offered to an earlier generation of liberal Christians who had sometimes lost their way. A regrounding in belief, a return, as Karl Barth put it, to the strange world of the Bible. As with Niebuhr himself, this doesn't mean giving up on liberal politics. Far from it. Rather, it means recovering the kind of theological belief that animated liberal Christianity at its most vital. And as the liberal Protestant scholar Gary Dorian has pointed out, the Christianity that infused causes like the social gospel and the civil rights movement was often much more dogmatic than present-day mainline Protestant faith. Its leaders had a deep grounding in Bible study, family devotions, personal prayer, and worship. They argued for progressive reform in the context of a personal, transcendent God, the divinity of Christ, the need for personal redemption, the importance of Christian missions. To read a document like the letter from Birmingham jail, right? A document, you know, the major rhetorical gestures of the civil rights movement, it's impossible to imagine those gestures working without a shared theological and dogmatic foundation that King could draw on in his appeals to his fellow Christians, Catholic and Protestant alike. And note again that Gary Dorian, who I just quoted, is not at all calling for liberal Christianity to become politically conservative or to abandon its commitment to a kind of social gospel, social justice view of the world, or to cease engaging critically and seriously with modernity's challenges to Christian belief. But he's calling for it to remain, or perhaps more aptly, to once again become recognizably Christian. Biblically and gospel-centered, liturgical and devotional, creedal and churched. In this view, the quest for social justice, while important, can't itself be separated from the quest for personal conversion. Institutions have to matter as much as good intentions, and no reinvention of Christianity can succeed if it requires completely reinventing Jesus Christ. And too often, I think the leaders of the Protestant mainline over the last two generations haven't offered potential believers anything you can't already get from some combination of a purely secular liberalism or the spiritual and self-help section on Amazon or at Barnes & Noble, which suggests that perhaps the time has come for the mainline to pause amid its attempts at renovation and reinvention and consider not only what needs to be changed about historic Christianity, not only what they would change, but what they would affirm, defend, and offer uncompromisingly to the world. Thank you very much.
If you have any
And now Paul Ryan will be joining us to deliver a rebuttal.
If you have any questions, if you would please come to the side aisles, or Peggy standing where I am.
Are there any Catholic authors who would recommend to bring this into perspective?
Well, it depends what precise perspective you want. But so, for instance, I talked a fair amount about sort of the chaos and convulsions of the 1960s and 70s, right? Which in the Catholic Church were mostly arguments about the interpretation and implementation of the Second Vatican Council and so on. And I think for anyone particularly interested in that trajectory and the ways in which it parallels and doesn't parallel the story of the Protestant mainline, I think you can really get a sense of it by reading books written in that era by two writers, both of whom are still living, James Hitchcock and Gary Wills, representing, in a sense, sort of a more conservative Catholic and a more liberal Catholic take. But if you read, for instance, both of these may be out of print, but of course everything's available on Amazon. If you read Wills's Bare Ruined Choirs, and Bare Ruined Choirs, it's called, after the Shakespearean line, alongside Hitchcock's book, I want to say The Strange Death of Radical Catholicism, but I may be forgetting the title exactly. But those are two books written right around the same time, one by Wills, a more sort of liberal Catholic, one by Hitchcock, a sort of former liberal Catholic who became one of sort of the first neoconservative Catholics, you might say, sort of writers who felt sort of the post-Vatican II era had gone too far. You get a real sense of sort of how those debates were playing out in real time and sort of how, the different factions felt about it. So that would be sort of a particular recommendation for that era. And obviously Wills has continued writing down to the present day. I'm, like I think many conservative Catholic writers of my generation, sort of particularly influenced by Richard John Newhouse, the late editor of First Things, who was himself a Lutheran pastor, a sort of participant in many of these mainline debates, who then became a convert to Catholicism. And if you read, his book, The Catholic Moment, actually written in 1987, I believe, before he became a Catholic, but it was written about sort of what the Catholicism of John Paul II meant for America and the world and so on. I think you'll get a good sense, again, obviously from a particular perspective, of sort of how the post-Vatican II era, the sort of debates within mainline Protestantism and the debates within Catholicism overlapped with one another. So those would be 3 recommendations, and then and the great thing about Amazon is you can see the other books that people who purchase those books, although since they're out of print, the other books will probably be even more obscure. So anyway, of course. Yes, sir.
As I said when I introduced myself, I don't often agree with you when I read you, but having come of age...
It's a description of 79% of my readers.
Well, that may be. Having come of age during what we euphemistically refer to as the sexual revolution in the 60s, every generation thinks they invented sex. I think it's been popular for long before that. I think the biggest difference between, let's say, when I came of age and 40 years before that or 40 years after is, which you put so much emphasis on of having the impact on the church, on religion, is not that. I think it's more, people are more aware of it, and I think its impact then is not, it changes people so much as it lets people see, because so much more is in the open, it lets people see that these people they've held up as heroes really are no more human than they were. The rabbi who oversaw my brother's bar mitzvah had a child less than 6 months after he was married.
That's a miracle.
Yeah, it was. And as my grandmother used to say, when they have the next one, he'll learn how to count. But even in the 50s, I doubt Billy Graham flew coach. So I think it's not so much that we've seen the change as the fact that just the mass media is out there and we see what's really going on. 50% of brides in the Elizabeth era, as I understand, were pregnant. And that really only happens one way. Certainly then it did.
That's true up to a point, but let me defend for a moment the idea that something actually did shift in behavior, sexual behavior in the 60s and 70s. Because, yes, it's obviously true, no matter what, what's the Philip Larkin poem that, sex was invented in 1963, which was somewhat late for me, he said, something like that. Yes, obviously, sex has always been with us, premarital sex has always been with us, and so on. But it is true that there's a distinction between premarital sex that tends to be sort of socially oriented towards the institution of marriage, and premarital sex that's sort of conceived of as, taking place not so much in a vacuum, but without any sort of directional, or, if it has a sort of directional valence, it's incredibly long term. So if you go back and look at, and again, the data is obviously a little murky, but you can go back and look at sort of survey data on sexual behavior, its relationship to marriage and so on, for the generation that was born in the 20s, say, versus the generation that was born in the 50s. And what you see is that the rate of premarital sex is, sort of similar from generation to generation. The number of sexual partners, though, goes up. The number of people who marry the first person they have sex with goes down. And then, sort of as a follow-on, obviously you can see this more explicitly in, the rise in the divorce rate. The rate of out-of-wedlock births in the United States has basically been on a steady and sort of dramatic incline ever since the 1960s. And that is, I think, it's been a sort of slow developing, but ultimately a huge social change, right, with profound implications for how children are raised and, the sort of life experience of children, and then sort of I can, if we want to go off on a tangent, I can get into a long discussion about sort of the impact of the decline of the two-parent family on inequality in the United States and so on. But so, yes, you're absolutely right that some of what happened was just sort of exposure, right? It was, sort of it was sort of the end of a certain kind of hypocrisy. It was, Alfred Kinsey's research revealing that, lots and lots of people masturbated and so on. I mean, yes, all of that is true. But there also was, I think, a real, a real revolution in sort of the way that that sex, which had always been with us, interacted with sort of patterns of courtship, patterns of marriage, and most importantly, patterns of child rearing. And again, in a lot of sort of the post-sexual revolution stability that we've achieved today, especially, in the upper middle class, also depends in large part on the legal, the availability of legal abortion, which is, there's many reasons why that's such a flashpoint, but this is one of them, right? That, and there too, of course, there was abortion before Roe versus Wade and so on, but if you look at sort of the impact of Roe versus Wade on, you can see very clearly if you dig into the data, just in terms of, the spikes in legal abortion, not just when Roe was handed down, but in the 5 to 10 years afterward, and then the gradual decline afterward and so on. There is a big shift in the number of abortions in America from 1958 to 1978. And the fact that abortions happened in 1958 doesn't change the scope of that shift. And again, it's just its impact on sort of how people think about sex, right? And how they think about marriage, how they think about children, and so on. So yes, up to a point, but there is a kind of, a real and radical and substantial disruption. And it's also useful, I think, to think about this. This is an analogy I sometimes use, that, there's a tendency for both conservatives and liberals to think of the sexual revolution something like the French Revolution, right? Or the Russian Revolution, where there's sort of, political groups, activists clashing, right? It's, it's Gloria Steinem versus Jerry Falwell, and, Hugh Hefner is either the Robespierre or the George Washington of the revolution, right? Depending on which side you're on. But in certain ways, the sexual revolution is a lot like the Industrial Revolution, right? Where it's sort of driven by particular technological inventions, sort of, in contraception and so on, also sort of deep structural economic factors, the movement of women into the workforce and so on. And that analogy, I think, should enable us today. I think there's one of the great drivers of the culture war today is a sort of liberal fear that to make any concessions that anything that happened in the sexual revolution had negative consequences is inevitably to sort of concede everything to the counter-revolutionaries, and the next thing you know, the Ancien regime is coming back, and and it's Puritanism and patriarchy as far as the eye can see. But if you look at the sexual revolution as more like the Industrial Revolution, as something, a lot of the trends that happened that I think are positive trends, sort of the vast new opportunities that opened up for women and so on, are trends that are not going to be reversed under almost any scenario. And if that's the case, then I think that progressives in particular should feel a little bit more comfortable sort of acknowledging, okay, just as the Industrial Revolution created excesses that needed to be curbed and so on, that the sexual revolution did the same. And so it isn't, sometimes I think progressives are in the position of sort of Manchester school liberals in the 1870s who are like, look, the Industrial Revolution has created so much wealth, and it's so wonderful, and if the price of that is 8-year-olds working in factories, then we just have to bear that price. And that's sort of the sense I get sometimes from the liberal conversation around abortion. It's like, if you're worried about abortion, I'm sorry, it's just the price of female progress. And I don't think that that's actually necessarily the case. But this is obviously a controversial view. So anyway. Yes, sir.
Your answers to the previous questions are so thought-provoking. I kind of forgot my own question here.
That's part of my plan.
I don't want to. I'm not looking for a long answer.
Yeah.
I just scratched some things down. As a Catholic myself, I'm very aware of the enclave mentality that pre-Vatican II, that was the way we did things. No one could see anything, and it's nobody's business, so to speak. With mainline Protestantism, should they or could they or were they mistaken in taking this accommodationist type road? Had they not, would they have been able to survive better than, say, you suggest they're doing today?
I think, that's obviously an implication that I would take, right? But I want to qualify it, right? I don't think, again, these sort of deep structural forces were going to create big problems for every Christian church, and they've created big problems for Catholicism as well. They've, it's not just the case that sort of there's just being an Orthodox Christian guarantees that your churches will grow and flourish and so on. And I think, some of mainline Protestant decline is just driven by sort of broader demographic realities where the kind of people who attend mainline churches are just a smaller share of the American population in our sort of more multiracial and so on society. I mean, it's tough, to sort of disentangle the decline of the mainline from the cultural decline of the WASP as a whole, which is sort of, again, a broader collection of issues. But in general, I think it's the case that even if the mainline churches had shrunk, more than, they were inevitably going to shrink from where they stood in 1955. But I think a greater level of sort of theological and dogmatic conviction would have created, at least in some places, greater resilience down the road. Now, where the rubber hits the road, of course, is on specific issues like gay marriage and so on. And there, I don't think there's sort of an obvious answer, right? I don't think it's obviously the case that, the Episcopalians shouldn't bless same-sex unions because then their churches will necessarily grow. It's not like a one-to-one thing there. And look, the other thing to keep in mind is everybody, I use the term accommodation critically, both in this talk and in the book, but, everybody accommodates in some way, shape, or form. And, the question is sort of striking a balance between accommodating on the one hand to changing circumstances and holding on to core convictions that give your religious faith its justification. And I think the mainline has struck that balance particularly poorly in certain ways over the last couple generations. Yes, Father.
Yes, my name is Father Belmonte. I'm a Jesuit priest and the superintendent of Catholic schools in the Diocese of Joliet here in the area.
I am suitably intimidated.
I don't know. I think what the previous gentleman said is more accurate. Just a couple things. One, I'm not part of the 99% or the 47%. I guess I can say now I'm part of the 21% that happens to agree with you. So maybe there are others in the room that would also be part of the 21%. And then also, Happy Year of Faith. I just wanted to begin, since we are beginning on October 11th, the beginning of the Year of Faith, started by Pope Benedict, no small moment. And so to be able to have this kind of conversation on this sort of day, I think is significant. And related to that, I would just be interested in your comment on the significance, any significance you attach to the vice presidential debate tonight between two Catholics, one from one generation and the other from another generation, and how you would see that, since we're not
I'm going to need to
debate.
check my Twitter feed in order to, catch up on what's actually been said. But I think that to sort of be specific, to be sort of specifically Catholic there for a moment, I think, as you might expect, given my political conservatism, I am closer to Paul Ryan on specific issues than I am to Joe Biden. But I also think that what their sort of generational difference represents is something that's particularly problematic for American Catholicism, which is the extent to which, because of the issue of abortion, this sort of, a large swath of American Catholics, basically feel like they can't vote for the Democratic Party, right? And what that means in turn is that, okay, so, there's been a shift of at least a certain kind of Catholic, and particularly sort of church-going, regular Mass-attending Catholics towards the Republican Party in a way that wasn't true generations ago. But the difficulty there is that it then becomes all too easy, having moved into a particular political coalition because of one specific issue, to sort of, become essentially polarized and assume that, everything that the Republican Party does represents the sort of fulfillment, the perfect fulfillment of Catholic social doctrine and so on. And what I think that, and this is not just a specifically Catholic thing, but what Christians in general should want from their politicians is, look, we have two parties, you're going to be a partisan. That's sort of, in some way, shape, or form if you're active in American politics. That's just a given. But you should always be looking for a way, if you're active in public life, to manifest some kind of Christian difference, right? And to find an issue or a set of issues where it's clear that you are a Catholic first or a Christian first and a Republican or Democrat second. And I think, so for instance, I think the decline of the pro-life Democrat is one of the great tragedies in our politics, and it's a tragedy both for Democrats and for Republicans, right? It's not, it's that kind of that kind of figure who sort of, embraces a particular political party but also has a view on an issue that represents a kind of critique of their own party, that's an incredibly important figure to have in a society that's become polarized. So a figure like, I would like to live in a world where Joe Biden, the Democratic vice presidential nominee, a Catholic, would be a staunch liberal who also happened to be pro-life. I would like to live in a world where someone like Ryan, who in many ways I admire very much, had a little more distance on some issue or another from sort of the basic Republican line. I would like there to be an element in the famous Ryan budget that the Wall Street Journal editorial page didn't like. I think that would be a good and healthy thing for Republicans, but also in particular for sort of, the role of Christianity in our public life. So, those are some scattered thoughts. Yes, sir.
Hi. As a Catholic, I've noticed, we have kind of attached ourselves to the fundamentalist, causes that we share. My question is how can we as Catholics, or even as mainline Protestants, develop a intellectual argument and develop our intellectual thoughts and get them out there compared to, I guess, just a pure fundamentalist, non-intellectual?
Well, I think the distinction, between the first sort of debate or publicity surrounding this book I did was a dialogue I did on the online magazine Slate with a secular liberal writer named Will Salatin. And the first question he put to me was, I was really interested in this book, Ross, by the distinction you made between orthodoxy and fundamentalism, right? Which was a distinction I hadn't really thought about before. Could you elaborate on that? And I tried to elaborate on it, maybe not effectively, but I think that distinction is the crucial distinction, and again, not only for Catholics to make, but for mainline Protestants and evangelicals as well. There's not, the evangelical tradition is not confined to fundamentalism. And I think ultimately for Christianity to thrive in the modern world, to be compelling and to be true, there has to be a sense of a sort of capacious orthodoxy that doesn't stand or fall on the question of whether dinosaurs and Adam and Eve were on the earth at the same time. And I mean, one of the points I've tried to make, I found myself making this point on Bill Maher's HBO show, which is, you end up in some fascinating situations in this line of work, but is that it's useful to think of fundamentalism itself as a more modern phenomenon than traditional Christian and Catholic orthodoxy, right? That many of the things we associate with fundamentalism, these sort of particular readings of the Bible, both the readings of Genesis on the one hand, and then the sort of dispensationalist, sort of rapture-oriented readings of Revelation and so on, emerge as kind of a mirror image to that modernism that I started my talk with, right? If modernism was a kind of secular utopianism, sort of locating, the eschaton in sort of, the divinizing the nation state and so on, fundamentalism was almost a kind of Christian answer to Marxism, right? It was like, oh, Marxists have their schema of history, and so we'll have our interpretation of the book of Revelation that, is itself a schematic. I mean, the idea of the rapture is a Victorian invention. There's no idea of the rapture in medieval Christian thought, for instance. And so, and if you look at the way Augustine and Aquinas talk about biblical interpretation versus the way that fundamentalists talk about biblical interpretation, there's much more room for sort of nuance and debate and symbolic and allegorical interpretations in the church fathers than there is in sort of writers in the 1920s. So I think that distinction is really important, and the recognition that orthodoxy is older and sort of has historical priority over fundamentalism is a really important thing for Christians to recognize, and then a really important point for us to make in public debates, that it's not that, in the old days, Christians all believed, that every word of the Bible had to be, read in this particular way, and then we encountered modern thought, and so we had to change. No, it's that sort of in reaction to the challenges of modernity, some Christians retreated into a cramped and sort of, frankly, sometimes fantastic reading of the Bible that, both sort of figures in the Protestant Reformation and figures in medieval Catholicism wouldn't have recognized as sort of traditional Christian biblical interpretation. Yes, sir.
So, as a parent, I'm not sure if you're a parent, but I have 3 kids, and I'm a little concerned and worried that they're becoming more engulfed and taken by the consumerism and the world as it is today. And I do struggle, with some of my, with my oldest kid, 13-year-old, that she is not as engaged in Christianity. So, what would you,
Listen,
say,
I have
recommend?
I have a 19-month-old, and you're just
Right,
terrifying me. I have no idea,
How we would bring the new generation back to those authentic traditions and a sense of community?
I mean, look, I really don't want to be in the position of giving parental advice given my total lack of experience. So just hedged with that qualification, all I would say is that, it is both important, especially with teenagers, to the extent that I remember what being a teenager was about, to make some version of this distinction that I just tried to make, right? To sort of make the case that there is room in Christianity for the kind of questions that teenagers in all their wonderfulness, right, perpetually want to ask. That, becoming a Christian isn't just a matter of, well, we're going to hustle you through confirmation class and you're going to, memorize some creeds and then we're going to get you through and so on. That it's something that the curious and engaged adolescent mind should be eager and interested to wrestle with, and that, Christianity, that doubt is woven into faith, in sort of deep and profound ways, right? I mean, it's you as you can't sort of tell a 13-year-old just go read Pascal and Kierkegaard, right? But you can sort of, in your conversations, I would hope. Again, we'll see how this works when my daughter's 13. You can sort of keep that sort of, those aspects of the Christian tradition in mind, and you can also, if this is sociology, this is not my personal experience, but the best indicator of sort of whether kids take faith seriously is whether their parents take faith seriously, and then in particular, the best indicator, because sort of the best indicator of whether children continue to practice their faith as adults is usually more whether the father practices the faith than just the mother alone, because in so many households, the mother is sort of the locus of religious energy and the father is sort of grunting and groaning, along for the ride and wants to go watch football. So in that sense, again, speaking statistically, not from any personal experience, just the act of sort of modeling Christian faith in everyday life is sometimes, the best you can do. And then, again, easy for me to say, but your kids, they're their own people, and there's only so much you can do. You have to have, once they're out of the house, as my mother realized when I turned 18, they're just in the hands of God in some sense. So, anyway, I don't know if that's helpful in any way. Now I will continue to be terrified about my daughter's future.
We have time for one more question.
Sir.
You were talking about the Protestant decline being that, they kind of tried to cater to the modernity and a lot of liberal causes. And, after Vatican II, and we had Pope Paul bringing the Catholic Church more back to more conservative footing. So is the decline in the Catholic Church because they didn't go far enough to the left, or they're coming back too far to the right?
Neither, I suppose. The decline in the Catholic Church is, the sort of initial decline is a consequence of, I think, just deep structural changes, right? And that would have happened, no matter what had happened with Vatican II, no matter, the sort of, Vatican II in particular is sort of less, liberals and conservatives have been fighting over the council for 2 generations, but ultimately, again, if you look at what happened in, Protestant churches as well, it's hard to see how Catholicism could have avoided some of the sort of decline and chaos and debate and everything that happened in the 60s and 70s. I think you can make a strong case that what John Paul II did in terms of sort of reaffirming, again, in the way that I think mainline Protestantism could benefit from, reaffirming certain core aspects of Catholic teaching was crucial in terms of, not in terms of restoring, Catholicism to sort of the levels of, mass attendance and priestly vocations that you'd had in 1955. That was never going to happen exactly. But in terms of sort of, maintaining a sort of vital core of Catholic culture in the United States in particular. I think that story looked a lot more positive, though, 10 years ago. I think the impact of the priestly sex abuse scandal has sort of created a sort of second wave of crisis in certain ways for Catholicism in the United States that has, that has sort of, it's less that it sort of, had convinced sort of very pious Catholics to fall away, and more that it sort of convinced more lukewarm Catholics that, the institution is sort of irredeemably corrupt and isn't worth bothering with. And then more importantly, in certain ways, it's just created, it's not just about sort of the public credibility of the church, it's also just, I was talking about sort of, the extent to which a religion is a web of institutions and networks and communities and so on. Think about the amount of money that the Catholic Church in the United States has had to pay out over the last 10 years in order to effectively atone for the crimes of priests and the, and the sins of bishops. And then think about how many, what Catholic schools could have done with that money, the number of churches that could have been built with that money. Think about how different the institutional vitality of the Catholic Church would look today if all that money had been available for the causes that the church is supposed to be funding, instead of being paid out, paid out to victims. So I think that sort of, more than these deeper issues that I started with, sort of digging out from the aftermath of the sex abuse crisis, is the biggest challenge facing the current generation of Catholic leaders. If you're a sort of Timothy Dolan in New York or a Charles Chaput in Philadelphia and so on, these sort of, this newer generation of bishops and archbishops and cardinals, it's sort of almost a generational project to rebuild both the financial resources and the public credibility that I think in many ways that had been sort of rebuilt under John Paul II, but then sort of lost in many ways over the last decade. So. All right, guys, you're free to go watch, Joe Biden, Paul Ryan, live from New York, or Danville, Kentucky, right? Anyway, thank you all so much for coming, and obviously I'll be right there for a little while. Oh, and no, don't leave, don't leave. I'm so sorry. I take it back.
You can just leave it. Yeah, it's
okay.
Hello, everybody. Top of the order first, I'd like to thank you all for coming to spend your night with us here at Elmhurst College. My name is Joseph McGee. I'm a theology student here at Elmhurst, class of 2013. Truly, Christianity does have a very long and rich history of self-criticism and reflection, and Mr. Douthat truly has continued that tradition here tonight. And but there's also a great deal of timidness and reluctance when it comes to speaking on those issues of the recline of Christian faith. But I think as long as we have our individuals like Mr. Douthat here that talk with such tenacity, that we will not yet truly go quietly into the night.
Right.
On behalf of Elmhurst College, I'd like to offer you this gift as a token of our appreciation.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you. I really, really appreciate it.
Mr. Douthat has also graciously agreed to sign books. If you'd wish to have your book signed, you can form a line in the center queue. Once again, I would like to thank you for attending this lecture. We encourage you, both on behalf of myself and the school as a whole, to attend further lectures. You can find out about those by visiting our website at www.elmhurst.edu. Once again, thank you for attending, and have a safe trip home.